Kamsamida.
Thank you very much.
Please excuse the fact that I do not speak in Korean. I must begin by thanking four persons. Seon Foundation President Ye Hee-soo Sunam, also the headmaster Hee Seol Sunam, and the Haman Science Institute Director Hee Yi-shan Sinam, and the Vice Director Dr. Lee Yang-hee. Thank you so very much. 감사합니다. I had a difficult time knowing what to do when I received the topic of discussion that I was to write something about. I was asked to speak about COVID-19, and I was told that I could put anything in the talk that I wanted to. So I did not have a too explicit mission or focus given to me at the start. And I was given this topic, although I have no authority in dealing with scientific matters. I do a bit of philosophy and theology, and that's about it, really. So I bring that into the work that I had to do. Oh, I suppose I should push this here. Okay. I find myself thinking of the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, and I've been thinking of him this morning. There is a connection between Heraclitus and Buddhism. I was told years ago by an American professor at Louvain. He was a student of the philosophy of Alfred Whitehead, the Englishman who taught later in the US. And he is the father of process philosophy, and he became the father of process theology when religious believers took his philosophy and brought that into the order of theology. And in Whitehead, change, perpetual change, is primary. And that recalls the philosophic insight of Heraclitus, who believed that perpetual change is primary. I was told years ago that in Buddhism, change is something which is very primary. And so when I was faced with this unusual topic and trying to determine what to say, trying to determine today what to say to you, because I came here largely ignorant of the work of Sengyon Master Daehong, one walks into the stream not knowing what will happen and what one will say. So let us simply be in that spirit. So I began this work on COVID-19 perplexed as to what to do. And one jumps into it, into the water, and you discover that there are many different problems that exist within this whole business of COVID-19. And no problem can be reduced to the other. It's a multitude of problems that cannot be reduced to one thing. So in the end, I came up with 6 distinct issues. The status of COVID-19 as a disease, man-made or artificial. Then this whole problem of who do we believe? Because when we do research on a controversial topic as this is, we go into the internet and we get all kinds of divergent views. And we don't know what to do about that. We are trained to believe in what experts tell us, what our teachers tell us. And we find disagreement amongst the so-called experts. And this was a continual problem for me in working on this topic. And it illustrates that we're faced with a cultural problem in the order of cognition when we have to deal now with the internet. Reminds me of an insight I came across. There was an Englishman, Hilaire Belloc, who wrote a book in 1912 called The Free Press, small book. I read it. And it warns against relying too much on the major newspapers when you read them. We tend to think that if we read the newspapers and so forth and listen to the TV news, we know what's going on in the world. But we may not really know what's going on in the world. And the experience of internet has brought that awareness to us. And this is central, I find, in dealing with the whole COVID crisis. Three, the whole controversy of trying to force people and all that type of thing. The question of side effects, short-term, long-term, liability, who is responsible if things go wrong. The generation of vaccines is also a distinct issue if we go into that. And then there's other implications. I only made a selection of possible implications. So there's a certain bias on my part as to what I selected. So let us maybe go to the first question here and see what we can do. Now, I have to make one confession here. I found in trying to deal with the question, is the COVID-19 virus man-made? Is it artificial? Or is it a purely natural thing over which we don't have much control? And in finding differences of opinion and in looking at all the data and reading through things, I found myself relying on advice that I found in a book by an English cardinal, Cardinal Newman, in his book, Grammar of Assent. And in that book, there is a criticism of the cognitional philosophy of John Locke, 17th century English philosopher. Now, Locke argued in his day that we can only truly know something if we know it with certitude. If we don't have certitude, then we cannot claim to validly know anything. And Newman criticized that position of Locke as too strict. Because if we truly examine how we know things and how we move towards judgments, we work with probabilities. We see where the evidence points. We find that no single piece of evidence conclusively proves anything. We rely on different experiences of evidence pointing in one direction. And at a certain point, the mind can move to making an affirmative judgment of some kind. Anyway, there were three options here. Contact with an infected animal, which points to a natural cause. An accidental laboratory leak, which implies that there was something happened in the laboratory, suggesting that the COVID virus was being cultivated in some way or being played around with. And three, you have a deliberate weaponization, a deliberate manufacture of a lethal pathological agent, the COVID-19 virus, which could be used by governments against other people. And I found that the probability points to a purely natural origin. Laboratory workers, for example, were not first infected. The COVID-19 virus most closely resembles the bat virus. The bat virus is apparently very difficult to cultivate in a laboratory. I don't take my word for that. That's what people say to me, that it's very difficult to cultivate the bat virus in the laboratory. There's a close resemblance, of course, between the two. Mutations, they talk, or maybe it's in my next slide here a bit. No, I'll go back to the other one. It's possible that there was a direct jump from an infected animal, or it's possible that the virus jumped from one animal to another animal and then finally into a human being, or it is possible that there was a direct jump into another human being, but changes occurred within the human being before the virus became pathological, it became lethal. Anyway, that was my finding, but of course you will find people who totally disagree with my conclusion that the evidence points to a purely natural origin. I sometimes wonder in these controversies how far our passions are operative in the things we want to believe. If we have ill will towards a particular people, if we have a feeling of ill will towards the mainline Chinese government and so forth, does this have an impact on our judgment as to how responsible the authorities are for this type of medical tragedy, this medical emergency? Anyway, that was the first problem I tried to deal with. On to the next one. Well, yes, who to believe? I've already sort of touched on that, but I found that there were two main points to try and make. Now, this largely deals with how to deal with the COVID virus after it breaks out and becomes an epidemic, a pandemic, when people become seriously threatened with it. And there is a difference in mentality between your scientists and your politicians. Your scientists tend to be very restricted in dealing with a particular question, and their mode of procedure is very controlled. They meet a very exact set of intellectual demands if their conclusions are to win scientific acceptance. Within their area of thought, they tend to be very consistent because, again, of the kinds of the intellectual demands that are raised when you ask theoretical scientific questions. Now, with politicians, you have a very pragmatic type of mentality. They tend to think not too much in the long term. They tend to think in meeting short-term demands, and of course they are subject to pressures from the outside. And so somebody from a scientific point of view here might suggest, for example, the reasonableness of a total lockdown to prevent people from catching the disease. And the professional people would tell the politicians that's what they should do. But then the politicians are faced with the human situation that it can be very difficult to win approval or consent from ordinary people. So you have this tension, and politicians may not be sure what to do. And if there's not a good knowledge of the different type of consciousness, if an awareness of differences in consciousness is not known, then that can cause problems. The one form of consciousness thinks that it is truly primary to the other. They each have a primary value. One is not totally primary in an absolute way. And that kind of lesson needs to be known. The second thing here, I will probably touch on this later on, and I've already talked about the contrast between certainty and probability. We, in the West, we live within a kind of cultural value or cultural distortion which emphasizes scientism, scientism, philosophy of scientism, where people assume that science is always right and that it is the only source of understanding things, the only correct source. Where scientific judgment will, in Aristotelian science, scientific knowledge is seen to be something which is certain. Scientific knowledge is certain. But if we look carefully at post-Aristotelian science, what we have really is scientific opinion, the best available scientific opinion. And so the scientists are not necessarily right. There is a possibility of error here. And this type of conflict is part of this problem of who to believe. So I felt it had to be mentioned. All right. Next issue. Now, this is experienced as a serious problem in some quarters. I live in the U.S., and you have two major political parties. You have the Republicans and the Democrats. Now, the Republicans tend to be against trying to force people to be vaccinated because they have a tradition of libertarianism, that the best kind of government is the least kind of government. Ideally, no government is best. People should be free to make their own decisions. So this business of government forcing people to be vaccinated, they're very much against that. Now, the Democrats tend to believe in the value of forcing people to be vaccinated, threatening people with loss of job and demotion and all that type of thing. And I have found it rather strange to find this amongst them, because in the U.S. there is a big emphasis on freedom. In the 18th century, you have stories of people planting liberty trees as a sign of opposition to British colonial rule, this business of liberty and freedom and all that. But the Democrats they espouse a certain kind of liberalism which emphasizes the importance and value of government intervention and creating a society where everybody is safe and all that. The value of having a social net to care for everybody who is in need. So they tend to be on the other side. Yeah. Now, Here I talk about compulsion and force. And on this side, you have this whole business of persuasion and cooperation. Now, there are two kinds of forces. There's external force, often material force. But then there is the inner force of one's understanding. Whenever we come to understand something and to believe in something, we want to do it. There is an inner kind of compulsion which exists in understanding. And the inner compulsion of understanding is the source of freedom, source of inner freedom. And to me, this is an utterly wonderful thing, that we can find freedom springing from our understanding and from our belief, which exists in understanding. I believe that there is an intimate connection between understanding and believing. I've been sensing this all morning here. There's no real division here. Oh, I see I must begin to speak shortly, not to say much. Well, all right, I guess I'll go on to the next one here. The whole question of side effects. We're familiar with short-term effects that some people have. I've never had any side effects at all, despite I've had 4 shots. I took the shots because I live in a monastic community, and I didn't want to disappoint my brother monks by not taking the shot. So I didn't behave maybe in a completely irrational way. Anyway, long-term effects. We can never know the long-term effects now with any medical procedure. That takes years before we can know about these things. And I think we have to accept that. I must stop now? Okay. All right. This is an issue that disturbs Catholics especially because of the Catholic rejection of abortion and this type of thing. I suspect abortion is, of course, rejected by others. And when you take vaccines from aborted children, what is the morality of that? Does this lead to beginning to use people as instruments, as means for your own purposes? And this is an extremely painful sort of thing. You can distinguish between formal and material cooperation. In our history, many terrible things happen, things that we don't approve of, and yet we benefit from them, unfortunately, in some way. What would be examples of that? Well, somebody told me, I don't know if this is true, that Velcro was developed in concentration camps during the war. So the origin of that is terrible. And yet something good came out of that. I think we have to admit that the world is set up in such a way that good can come out of evil. But we should never desire to do anything evil. This is the last sort of thing here. We have this conflict between zero tolerance and controlled risk. Zero tolerance, in some cities in China, they would shut everything down. That happened in Italy and so forth. Is that really an intelligent way of doing things? Because there's a huge price that is paid when you force people to stay in their home. They cannot go out, they cannot do any work. You separate people from others. And I think that has been mentioned already in some of the talks we've had here. Now, we can only move towards a controlled risk situation if we have a decent human community that we live in. If we care for each other and are sensitive to the needs of others, we immediately, automatically, we protect them from us. We take measures. Governments do not have to tell us what to do. We can care for each other in a very local way quite effectively. And so we reduce the dangers of unhealthy elderly people becoming sick and coming down with COVID. If we younger people, I try to still feel that I'm young, if we younger people get it, well then we're not going to worry too much about it. We try to protect our elderly, however. And we need to develop policies that respect this difference. Last thing, in a society which devalues spiritual values, if religion is regarded as a purely private thing, as a purely eccentric thing that is of no real importance or consequence, materialistic policies will come into effect. This was mentioned here already, that when the goods of the body are more important than the goods of the soul, then there's a whole type of human good that is being ignored, short-circuited. And that can do a lot of damage to people. I will end on that note, and thank you so very much for having me come. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the interesting talk.